Welcome to Constellation. We have a lot to talk about.
There is something about perfection that should make you suspicious. Not because perfection is impossible, though it is, but because the desire to build something perfect has always, in the full arc of human history, required someone to decide what perfect means. And that decision, that quiet foundational choice about what belongs and what doesn't, what gets the clean white facade and what gets pushed beneath the floor, that decision is always made by someone with something to gain. New Atlantis doesn't announce itself as a city of contradictions. It announces itself as the opposite, the logical conclusion of everything humanity managed to survive. You approach it from the landing pad, and the city opens in front of you, towers of pale composite material reaching into Jemison sky, clean walkways, ambient lighting that never quite flickers, a tree at the center of it all that seems to have been growing longer than anyone fully accounts for. The Sanctum Universum rises nearby, its golden architecture framing a faith oriented toward the infinite. The commercial district hums. Citizens move through the upper avenues with the quiet confidence of people who believe they are living inside the answer to something. And maybe they are. Maybe New Atlantis is exactly what it claims to be: the most advanced, the most stable, the most thoughtfully designed human settlement in the settled systems. No city in the galaxy is more deliberate. No capital was drawn more carefully. It was built to become something on a world chosen for its potential, rather than inherited for its history, and every surface street was placed with intent. But here is what stays with you after you've walked all of it, after you've descended into the well and seen what the towers cast their shadows over, after you've stood in MAST and listened to the language of governance, the careful, measured, institutional language that tells you everything except what it's protecting. After you've traced the quiet history of the United Colonies back through the blood it was built on, and the truths it decided, somewhere along the way, were better sealed away. New Atlantis was built to be the beginning of something new. The name says it plainly: Atlantis, the mythological city of perfection, the ideal civilization lost to time. A new one, a second chance, a city that wouldn't repeat the failures of everything that came before it. What no one in the settled system seems to stop and ask, what very few people, even among those who have lived here for years, seem to feel the need to ask, is whether any civilization can actually start over. Whether you can pack the worst of what humanity is into a colony ship, cross the void between stars, land on a new world, and leave the patterns behind. Or whether the patterns are the ones doing the packing. The question isn't whether New Atlantis is beautiful. It is. The question isn't whether the United Colonies have built something durable and impressive. They have. The question is, what did they have to bury to build it? To understand what New Atlantis is, you have to understand what it refused to be. When humanity left Earth, it didn't leave organized. There was no single fleet, no unified charter, no tidy departure with a plan for what came next. The settling was a slow dispersal, driven by a combination of desperation, ambition, and the particular human talent for moving somewhere new without fully reckoning with why you're leaving. The people who made it across the void settled on worlds across the Alpha Centauri system and beyond, and they built communities the only way people know how to build them, imperfectly, urgently, out of whatever they had. For a time, that worked. Small settlements, provisional agreements, frontier arrangements that held together because everyone had more pressing things to worry about than political theory. But the void has a way of sharpening tensions rather than dissolving them. Resources become contested, jurisdictions blur. The question of who gets to make decisions, and for whom, starts to matter enormously when the answer determines whether your settlement survives the next decade. The United Colonies emerged from this pressure as something that wanted to be more than just the strongest faction in the room. The UC's founding premise was deliberately ideological, that humanity needed a stable, centralized structure of governance that could provide security, coordinate development, and, most critically, break with the old models. No monarchies, no inherited aristocracies, no political dynasties carrying their entitlements across light years. Citizenship earned, not assumed. Authority derived from function, not from bloodline. It was an ambitious idea, and the people who built New Atlantis believed in it, or at least believed in the version of it they were telling. Jemison was chosen for a reason, not simply because its environment was hospitable, though it is in the temperate, almost Earth-approximate way that made early colonists breathe a little easier, but because it had no prior settlement of significance, no established power structure to inherit, no existing community to displace or absorb, no historical weight pressing down on whatever they tried to build. If you wanted to create a capital that carried no one's flag but the UC's, you needed a world that hadn't already been claimed by someone else's story. What happened next is not quite what the city's upper skyline suggests. The original colony wasn't built where the towers now stand. It was built underground, dug into the edge of a plateau below the place where the first colony ship, the Galileo, made landfall, harnessing the energy of a natural waterfall for power. That underground settlement, built out of necessity and early frontier pragmatism, would eventually become the Well, not a place the upper city later pushed its complications into, but the actual foundation that the city grew above. New Atlantis was not drawn on clean paper and then populated. It began in the dark, practical, and unglamorous, and only expanded to the surface in 2160, when the colony was stable enough to spread and the need to house evacuees from Earth became too pressing to contain underground any longer. The United Colonies designated New Atlantis its capital in 2161. By that point, the surface construction had already begun taking on its deliberate shape. MAST's spire rising at the center, the districts spreading outward, the city learning to look like what it was meant to be. And it was meant to be something specific, the visual proof that a new kind of governance had taken root. Not a castle, not a fortress, not the gated compound of some old-world power. A city with open walkways and natural light, built to feel like an invitation. The city's most iconic feature is arguably not architectural at all. At the center of the MAST district, there is a tree, a massive living thing that rises through the heart of New Atlantis with a kind of patient indifference to everything that was built around it. The Sanctum Universum, the religion that holds the universe itself as something worthy of awe and devotion, has built its presence beside it, and there's something fitting about that. A faith oriented toward the infinite, finding its home next to something rooted, growing, stubbornly alive. The tree functions almost as a symbol the city didn't plan. Among all the deliberate geometry of New Atlantis, it is the one thing that simply is. The United Colonies spent the early decades of New Atlantis's existence doing what new powers do: consolidating, expanding jurisdiction, formalizing the agreements that would become law, and inevitably coming into contact with other communities that had their own ideas about governance and autonomy. The Centaurus Proclamation of 2161 granted UC citizens the right to settle distant worlds and form their own sovereign powers, and within a generation, that right had produced a rival. The Free Star Collective, formally organized in 2189 from an alliance of the Cheyenne and Volii systems, positioned itself philosophically as the UC's opposite, a libertarian confederation dedicated to personal freedom and local autonomy over centralized control. Not just politically different, ideologically divergent in a way that made coexistence uncomfortable. The UC's founding premise was that stability required coordination and law. The collective's was that true freedom required neither being coordinated nor governed from a center that was hundreds of light years away. The friction between them found its limit in two wars. The first was the Narion War, which began in 2196, after the UC placed a star station above the planet Dipala, without the approval of the locals, and the Narion system voted to join the collective in response. That war ended in 2216 with the Treaty of Narion, which formalized the borders both powers could settle, a temporary resolution that both sides spent the next century quietly testing. The Colony War, which erupted in 2308, was the place where those philosophies finally found their breaking point. It began when the Free Star Collective built a farming colony on the planet Vesta in the Lunara system, territory the UC considered a violation of the Treaty of Narion. Diplomacy failed. The UC destroyed the colony. The collective responded, and the war spread across the galaxy, with both sides deploying everything they had: fleets, mechanized combat platforms, and, on the UC's part, the products of a research program that would leave marks on the settled systems far longer than the war itself. The Colony War ended in 2311 at the Battle of Cheyenne, where a superior UC Navy fleet was defeated by a Free Star response that leveraged both civilian ships and military in a decisive reversal. The UC, exhausted and unwilling to sustain further losses, accepted terms. The resulting armistice formalized a new peace and banned xeno-weapons and mechanized warfare, weapons both sides had used to devastating effect. 3 senior UC officers were publicly tried and convicted of war crimes: Commander Henry Durant, General Indira Rastogi, and Fleet Admiral Francois Sanon, known by the call sign Ve Victus. All 3 were sentenced to death. What the city of New Atlantis from its towers absorbed of all this was relatively little. The war happened elsewhere. Its streets remained clean. And when it was over, New Atlantis resumed being what it had always presented itself as: the calm, ordered center of a stable civilization. What the city did not do, what cities rarely do, was build a public reckoning with what the war had cost. What had been done in the UC's name. The armistice was a diplomatic achievement. It was not a confession. And that gap between what happened and what gets remembered is where New Atlantis's real story begins. Walk through New Atlantis long enough, and you start to notice the way the city manages your experience of it. Not through any obvious coercion. There are no checkpoints between districts, no explicit hierarchy announced by signage or barriers. But the city's layout communicates a great deal without saying a word, and once you learn to read it, you can't quite stop. The upper districts of New Atlantis are where the city's best version of itself lives. The commercial district is bright and functional, full of vendors and storefronts that cater to people with disposable income and time. The residential towers house UC citizens and their families in modest but livable comfort. And rising at the center of the MAST district, flanked by embassies and the city's major civic institutions, the MAST building, home of the military, administrative, and scientific triumvirate, the governing council of the United Colonies, dominates the skyline with the quiet confidence of a structure that has never once doubted its own legitimacy. MAST is, in a formal sense, a structure of distributed authority. The three arms, military, administrative, and scientific, each equal and working in coordination, each functioning within a cabinet chaired by the President of the United Colonies. The building is open. Citizens can enter. Representatives can be petitioned. The UC does not govern from behind locked doors, and it would very much like you to notice that. But the architecture of governance and the reality of it are different things. MAST is a building designed to make authority feel approachable, which is a very different thing from making authority actually answerable. The language inside MAST is the language of institutions everywhere, measured, procedural, and fundamentally oriented toward the continuation of the institution itself. Every major decision in the settled systems, every treaty, every military deployment, every resource allocation runs through this building or the cabinet that convenes within it. That is not a conspiracy, it's a design. The UC built a central authority on purpose, and central authority, by its nature, concentrates. What the upper city does not readily show you is what it's resting on. Beneath New Atlantis, literally beneath it, in the original underground grid of passages and rooms that predate the surface city entirely, is the well. The history of how it came to be what it is now is worth understanding carefully because the common assumption gets it backwards. The well was not a byproduct of the upper city's success. It is older than the towers. It was the first settlement, the original colony built underground, practical and utilitarian, carved into the plateau beneath the Galileo's landing site and powered by a natural waterfall. The surface city grew above it, not around it, and as New Atlantis expanded and refined itself upward, the well remained below, dimmer than the upper city, more crowded, populated by people who exist in New Atlantis's economy without quite existing in its civic narrative. This matters because it means the well's current character, the contrast between it and the gleaming streets above, was not imposed by the city's design. It emerged from it. The underground space was always there. The question of who ended up living in it and why is the part the city doesn't examine too carefully. Technicians, traders of ambiguous legality, wanderers who needed somewhere to stop and found that stopping in the well costs less than stopping above. The well is not a slum in any dramatic sense. It functions. It has its own community, its own commerce. Even the House of the Enlightened, New Atlantis's rationalist humanist congregation, has its home down here rather than in the surface districts. But it is undeniably what gets produced when a city's social mobility has a ceiling and its geography has a floor. The well exists in part because New Atlantis is a city with a citizenship system, and not everyone in the well is a citizen. The UC's approach to citizenship is one of its most philosophically loaded features and one of its most consistently misrepresented. The official framing is that UC citizenship is earned rather than inherited, that any human being can become a full citizen by performing a term of service to the UC, whether military, scientific, or administrative. This is presented as democratizing, as the UC's rejection of the aristocratic models that defined old Earth governance. And on one level it is. Even the children of existing citizens must earn their own standing. There are no birthright titles in New Atlantis, no surnames that open doors automatically. But what the framing obscures is that earned citizenship implies unearned non-citizenship, and that distinction carries real weight. Non-citizens in UC space occupy a liminal position, present, functional, contributing to the economy and the daily fabric of life, but excluded from the full rights and legal protections that citizenship confers, including, practically, the right to purchase property in New Atlantis itself. The well is, among other things, a geography of that liminality. It is where people who have not yet served, or will not, or cannot, tend to accumulate, not by any explicit policy that says so, but by the quiet pressure of a city that has structured its best resources for those with the right documentation. The UC Vanguard, the civilian fleet branch of the UC Navy founded in 2315, through which non-citizens can earn standing by serving in security, logistical, and reconnaissance roles, is, among other things, a pipeline. It takes people who need something from the UC and offers them the thing they need in exchange for assuming a particular kind of risk on the UC's behalf. The Vanguard is not coercive in any explicit sense, but it is designed to be attractive to exactly the people who have the least, and that design is not accidental. What the well shows you, if you're paying attention, is that New Atlantis does not have a problem with inequality. It has a solution to inequality that produces a different kind of inequality and considers the matter resolved. The United Colonies have always been better at structure than at self-examination. This is not unique to them. It may be the defining characteristic of every durable institution in history, but it expresses itself in the UC with particular clarity because the UC was explicitly founded on the premise of doing things differently. When you start with a promise of structural improvement and then produce an institution that resists examining itself, the gap between the ideal and the practice becomes the most interesting thing about it. The UC cabinet sits at the effective center of UC governance. The president, security chief, chief engineer, chief diplomat, and fleet admiral meeting in the chamber at the top of the MAST tower, making the decisions that move the settled systems. The system was designed, at least in theory, to prevent the kind of concentrated authority that the UC's founders associated with old Earth's governance failures. Each of the three arms of MAST is equal. No single branch dominates. Distributed function, checks on arbitrary power, the hope that coordination among three different institutional priorities would prevent any one of them from consuming the others. What it produces in practice is something subtler. A government where authority is technically distributed but operationally concentrated among the people who understand the cabinet's machinery well enough to navigate its gaps. The UC's bureaucracy is not corrupt in any simple sense. Its officials are, for the most part, genuinely committed to the UC's stability and long-term success. But commitment to an institution and accountability to the people that institution governs are different things, and the UC's various oversight mechanisms are primarily designed to manage the former. UC System Defense, SysDef, occupies a particularly revealing position within this structure. Formerly a special division of the UC Navy, SysDef was founded with a specific mandate: to destroy the Crimson Fleet, which by the mid-22s had grown beyond what ordinary UC security could contain. After a man named Jasper Cricks broke free from the UC's orbital prison, known as the Lock, claimed the space station that would become the Key as his base, and built a pirate coalition that the UC Navy failed to dislodge in multiple direct assaults, SysDef was created to pursue the problem through means that the regular Navy found difficult: undercover operations, intelligence infiltration, methods that didn't need to surface in the public record. The Crimson Fleet is in some ways SysDef's shadow, and perhaps the UC's shadow in a broader sense. The fleet is not simply a random accumulation of lawlessness. It is a collection of people who found themselves outside the UC's categories and structures, who needed to survive and found that survival outside the law was more accessible than survival within it. It flourishes in the gaps left by governance that is extensive in its reach but selective in its protections. The fleet and SysDef are adversaries who define each other, and looking at them together tells you something the UC's official self-presentation doesn't. What SysDef's existence reveals about the UC is not that the UC is uniquely villainous. It reveals that the UC, like every durable institution across human history, has developed a hierarchy of priorities in which its own continuation and reputation sit above almost everything else. SysDef's operational latitude, its ability to run intelligence operations that don't require public justification, to classify findings, to pursue results through channels that never surface to the cabinet officially, is the institutional version of the same logic that produced the well. Not everything the UC needs done can be done visibly. Some of it needs to happen below the surface, where the towers don't illuminate. The story of Londinion is the clearest case study available. Londinion was a UC colony on the planet Ptolemy II. built around the time of the Colony War as a critical supply hub for the UC's war effort. And the threat that destroyed it did not come from outside the UC's sphere. It came from within it. During the Colony War, the UC's Xeno-Warfare Division was tasked with weaponizing alien fauna. The Terramorphs, creatures of extraordinary lethality, apex predators with physical capabilities that overwhelmed standard military defenses, were identified as potential weapons. The attempt to control them was, in the language one UC lore document uses, an unmitigated disaster. The Terramorphs proved impossible to direct, ultimately escaping from the Crete research lab where the experiments were being conducted. And in the midst of the Colony War, on the planet Ptolemon II, a Terramorph outbreak of unprecedented scale swept over Londinion. The city's defenses failed quickly. The creatures proved unstoppable. Fleet Admiral François Sanon, V. Victus, made the decision to order the orbital bombardment of the Londinion spaceport. The logic was containment. If the Terramorphs were allowed to board evacuating ships, they would spread to every world humans had settled. Sealing the spaceport meant sealing the city, and it meant sealing the people still inside it. The armistice records show Sanon was tried for war crimes and sentenced to death alongside 2 other senior officers. What the public record does not show, what the UC chose not to make part of the official account, is that Sanon's execution was faked. The UC considered him too valuable to lose. V. Victus was secretly imprisoned and kept alive as an institutional asset. The same government that sentenced him for the decision to bomb Londinion made the decision not to actually carry out the sentence, then sealed that decision away from the people most entitled to know it, the families of everyone who died in Londinion's ruins. Furthermore, by the time of Starfield's events in 2033, evidence surfaces during the UC Vanguard questline suggesting that Sanon already knew, before he ordered the bombing, about the connection between heat leeches, the larval precursor to Terramorphs, and a plant native to Londinion that could accelerate their metamorphosis. Whether that knowledge shaped his decision and what it means that it was never disclosed is something the UC has had nearly 2 decades to address. It has not addressed it. What Londinion reveals about the UC is not that it is uniquely villainous. It reveals that the UC, like every durable institution across the full record of human history, has developed a hierarchy of priorities in which its own continuation sits above almost everything else. Citizens matter in the UC's framework, but the institution matters more because the institution, from the inside, looks like the precondition for everything else mattering at all. Remove the UC and you remove the stability that allows citizens to survive. Therefore, protect the institution, even from the citizens, especially from the truths that would destabilize it. This logic is not irrational, viewed from within its own premises. In a frontier system still fragile enough that genuine political collapse is a realistic possibility, there is something to be said for maintaining structural stability. But it is logic that has, in every civilization that has ever produced it, the same long-term effect. It gradually detaches institutions from the populations they were built to serve, until the institution's primary function becomes self-perpetuation, and the population becomes the resource that feeds it. New Atlantis, from its towers, looks like a city that has solved that problem. The problem has not been solved. The terramorph crisis did not begin at Londinion. It began earlier, in the careful, procedurally approved language of military research, in the kind of institutional decision-making that is designed to look orderly while producing outcomes that are not. To understand the weight of what happened, you need to sit with what terramorphs actually are, not in the abstract biological sense, but in the experiential sense. They are not simply dangerous. They are overwhelming in a way that breaks the usual calculus of threat response. A settlement equipped to handle most of what the frontier could produce was not equipped to handle a terramorph incursion, and the speed with which a populated area could become uninhabitable is something that most UC military strategists had experienced until Londinion, primarily in classified simulation rather than in reality. The Xeno-Warfare Division, also known as the Red Devils, represents one of the clearest examples of institutional moral hazard in the settled systems. The people who ran those programs were not acting without rationale. They had looked at the hostile biology of the frontier and concluded that understanding and weaponizing the worst of it was preferable to being surprised by it. Their reasoning was defensible within the framework that structured their choices. But frameworks are the thing. The framework that allowed those programs to proceed was the same framework that allowed their failures to be classified, their consequences to be absorbed without public accountability, and the people of Londinion to die without their deaths becoming a genuine reckoning. The framework is the infrastructure of the rot. What the UC did after Londinion was not exceptional. It was standard. Seal the research, adjust the official account, convict the admiral, then quietly keep him alive. The people within SysDef and the cabinet who held the fuller picture were, in many cases, genuinely troubled by what they carried. You can sense that in the careful way certain records are phrased, the language that avoids saying directly what it knows, that makes room for institutional deniability without quite lying. Complicity is rarely enthusiastic. It is usually reluctant, rationalized, incremental, and performed by people who believe, at least in the beginning, that they are doing what the situation requires. New Atlantis does not talk about Londinion in any deep way. That is the most revealing thing about it. A city that positions itself as the aspirational center of human civilization, the proof that humanity can do better. And at its administrative core is a building full of people who have chosen not to know certain things, or who know them and have found ways to hold them at a distance that leaves the narrative intact. House Va'ruun complicates the city's self-image in a different register. The origins of House Va'ruun trace back improbably to New Atlantis itself. A colony ship called the Archimedes departed from here in 2190, reported lost, and vanished into what would become the Kavnik system. The passengers who survived that journey underwent a transformation over the following decades, coalescing around the prophet Jinan Va'ruun and the faith he built around an entity he claimed to have encountered during a grav jump. The Great Serpent, a cosmic being awaiting its awakening. By 2230, House Va'ruun had emerged as a fully formed theocratic government and made contact with the settled systems. Diplomatically at first, then violently. In 2240, Jinan declared the Serpent's Crusade, an all-out war on all non-believers. For 23 years, thousands of UC, Freestar, and independent settlers were killed by Varun agents in the name of their faith. The war ended only when Jinan died in 2263, and his son Jarek sued for peace. In the years that followed, House Varun made genuine efforts at rehabilitation. Jarek built an embassy in New Atlantis, in the MAST district itself, physically close to the UC's seat of governance, as a sign of intended goodwill. Those efforts largely failed. The fear and mistrust left by the Serpent's Crusade proved too deep. After the ratification of the Colony War Armistice in 2311, an order arrived from Varunkai calling all embassy staff home. Everyone left except for Ambassador Khosrik Balmor, who chose to stay, believing it was his duty to maintain whatever thread of peace remained. By 2330, the embassy stands largely abandoned, its gardens still tended, its doors functionally closed, a building the city has arranged itself around without ever quite deciding what to do with. What the presence of that embassy reveals, held next to the visibility of the Sanctum Universum beside the tree in the city center, is something worth sitting with. The Sanctum Universum occupies one of the most visible, most central real estate positions in New Atlantis. It coexists comfortably with the UC because its orientation toward the universe as an object of reverence, toward scientific exploration as a form of devotion, never positions it against institutional authority. A faith that asks you to look outward at the stars is a faith that poses no political challenge to the government that controls access to them. House Varun, by contrast, carries the weight of the Serpent's Crusade. Its embassy sits in disrepair. What the settled systems at large makes of individual Varun believers, those who carry the faith without carrying its violent history, is harder to say. The lore doesn't confirm a population of Varun practitioners quietly living in New Atlantis, and it would be too tidy to assume the city hosts a secret religious underground. What we can say, based on what's actually present, is this. The UC's tolerance for spiritual life is real, but it is shaped by history. Sanctum Universum passes through that history untouched. House Varun does not, and the contrast in how they're treated tells you something about where the UC's stated pluralism reaches its edge. That is the difference between tolerance and acceptance. The UC offers the former. The latter would require holding the full complexity of what people are, including the parts that don't simplify cleanly. Cities are not only the institutions that govern them, they are also the people who find ways to live inside the gaps of those institutions, and New Atlantis has gaps. The well is the most visible one, but it is far from the only one. Across New Atlantis, in the corners of districts that the UC's official attention doesn't linger on, there are people operating in the space between what the United Colonies are and what they claim to be. Traders working in goods that the UC would prefer to regulate out of existence. Information brokers who understand that in a city built on curated truth, raw information is itself a form of currency. People who arrived in New Atlantis with histories that don't translate cleanly into citizen applications or service records. The Trackers Alliance occupies one of the more interesting of these gaps. Functioning as a bounty hunting and retrieval network with agents stationed across the settled systems, their presence a familiar sight in most major cities, their headquarters situated in Aquila City rather than New Atlantis. The trackers operate across faction lines, doing work that the official structures of both major governments find useful but at arm's length. They pursue criminals that UC security and Freestar Rangers alike would rather have brought in through methods that don't always align with official procedure, justified by results. What the trackers reveal is that New Atlantis functions, in part, by outsourcing the aspects of itself it would prefer not to examine too carefully. The city needs certain things done that UC law and UC procedure make difficult. Those things still get done. They just get done by people the UC can disavow if the need arises, people whose presence in the settled systems serves a function without requiring the city to take any responsibility for them. Among the ordinary people of New Atlantis, the citizens who wake up in the residential towers, work in the commercial district, send their children through UC educational programs, and believe with genuine conviction in the civilization they're part of. There is a sincerity that the city's contradictions don't fully negate. This matters. The flaws of New Atlantis are real, but so is the faith of its residents in what it represents. That faith is not stupid or naive. It is the reasonable response to a city that provides, for those within its full protections, a genuinely high quality of life, security, stability, access to some of the best scientific and medical resources in the settled systems, price controls on goods, a rule of law that, within its own definition, functions. The problem is not that New Atlantis fails its full citizens. The problem is that it defines full citizen in ways that exclude a significant portion of the human population it claims to represent. And it maintains that exclusion by making it structurally invisible, not by announcing the boundary, but by building the city in such a way that the boundary never needs to be announced. You can walk through New Atlantis and encounter a vendor in the well who is clearly competent, clearly contributing, clearly integrated into the social fabric of the city. Someone who has been a resident for years without having completed the service requirement that citizenship demands. In the UC's framework, this person is a non-citizen, which is a bureaucratic category with legal weight. In the human framework, in the framework the UC claims as its philosophical foundation, this person is as much a part of New Atlantis as anyone in a tower. The gap between those two assessments is where the city's contradictions live, and where some of the most interesting people in the settled systems make their home. People who have learned to navigate institutions without being consumed by them. People who have a clear view of what the city is because they have never been permitted the comfortable distance of believing only in what it claims to be. The Freestar settlers who pass through New Atlantis, traders, travelers, people navigating the economic networks that span both major powers, carry with them a perspective that long-term residents rarely access. They see the city from outside its own story. They notice the things that familiarity teaches people to overlook. The way the well's ambient light is calibrated slightly dimmer than the upper cities. The way certain questions in MAST get redirected rather than answered. The way the UC's public history displays in the Vanguard Orientation Hall tend to frame events in the period just before the details that would require the most explanation. The Freestar perspective is not necessarily more accurate. The collective has its own self-serving narratives, its own instinct toward institutional protection. But it is differently positioned, and different positioning reveals different things. Looking at a city from inside it teaches you to accept its logic. Looking at it from outside teaches you to ask whether the logic was a choice. What both perspectives share, if you're willing to hold them simultaneously, is a sense that the settled systems are still, in some meaningful way, figuring out what they are. The colony war is recent, barely a generation ago. The Serpent's Crusade, which killed thousands over 23 years, is still within living memory for the oldest residents of the systems. The institutional structures that govern both major powers are young by any historical measure. The mistakes of the old world are present in them, not as inevitable repetitions, but as patterns that haven't yet been fully examined, fully named, fully chosen against, rather than simply inherited. New Atlantis was built to be the place where that examination finally happened. It has not yet become that place, but it has also not stopped presenting itself as if it has. And that gap between the examination promised and the examination deferred is the most human thing about it. Stand at the upper edge of New Atlantis, where the towers reach their highest point and the city spreads below in the amber tone of Jemison's evening, and you can feel something that is not quite hope and not quite unease, but lives in the particular space between them. The city is real. Its ambitions are real. The people who walk its streets and believe in what it represents are real, and their belief is not hollow. It is built on genuine achievement, genuine security, genuine moments where the UC's promise translated into something a person could hold in their hands. New Atlantis has produced science that changed the settled systems. It has provided the institutional backbone for a fragile cluster of human civilizations to survive genuinely catastrophic pressure. In the specific operational sense, it has worked. But a thing can work and still be incomplete. A city can be beautiful and still be telling less than the full story. Not through the scheming of a hidden cabal, not through the cartoonish malice that makes comfortable villains, but through the slow accumulation of small decisions that all individually seemed reasonable. The choice to classify rather than disclose, to restrict rather than expand, to manage stability at the cost of honesty, to define citizen narrowly enough that the people who benefit most from the definition never have to ask whether it is fair. The well exists because New Atlantis cannot look at itself fully. Londinion's erasure exists because the UC could not survive, or believed it could not survive, the public weight of what it had done and failed to do. The abandoned Varun embassy stands because the city's idea of tolerance has never been tested by a faith that genuinely threatens its self-image. The Crimson Fleet exists, in part, because the UC's authority has edges it sharpens rather than examines. The Xeno-Warfare Division existed, and its legacy is still present in the form of terramorphs moving through every settled world, because the institution approved a research program and then sealed away the consequences. These are not small details on the margins of the city's story. They are the story's structure. They are the load-bearing elements of the illusion, and the illusion is the same one that has appeared in every civilization that has ever built beautiful towers over complicated foundations, that the new world would be different from the old one, that the crossing of the void would serve as a kind of moral reset, that the people who arrived here were changed enough by what they had survived that the same patterns would not reassert themselves. They were not changed enough. They were people, carrying the full weight of what people are, capable of extraordinary vision and ordinary cowardice, capable of building something genuinely worth believing in, and then protecting it by ensuring that certain things about it never get examined too carefully. The crossing of the void is real. The distance from Earth is real. None of it was far enough to leave behind the tendency to bury what doesn't fit. New Atlantis is not the end of history. It is history continuing. And the continuation looks familiar in ways that the city's founders, had they been honest with themselves, might have anticipated. And yet, there is something about the tree at the center of the city that is worth sitting with. It was not planned. It was not placed there by a MAST committee with a mandate for greenery or civic symbolism. It simply grew in the way that living things grow, indifferent to the blueprints drawn around it, and the city built itself in response to it. And at some point, the people of New Atlantis decided it was the heart of the place rather than an inconvenience. The sanctum universum, the faith that holds the universe itself as the thing worth believing in, found its home beside it, beside something alive and unmanaged, at the center of one of the most managed human environments in the galaxy. Maybe that's what New Atlantis actually is in the end. Not the perfect city it was designed to be, and not simply the cautionary tale its buried histories make it. Something in between, a place where the human drive toward order and the human refusal to stay ordered have been living alongside each other for long enough that neither has fully won. Where institutional will and organic, ungovernable reality are in a constant, unresolved tension that neither side has yet figured out how to end, or perhaps how to stop needing. The question that opened this, what did they have to bury to build it, doesn't have a single clean answer. What they buried was messier and more varied than any single story can hold. Classified research, unacknowledged casualties, the full complexity of faiths they couldn't absorb, the lived experience of people the city decided were a category rather than a constituency, the history that comes right before the part they chose to remember, the admiral whose death sentence they faked because the institution needed him more than the truth did. What they built above those buried things is genuinely impressive. That is the specific discomfort at the center of New Atlantis, and at the center of every human city that has ever tried to be something better than what came before it. The achievement and the concealment arrive from the same source. The same will to order that produces the towers also decides what goes underground. What then would a city look like that could hold its full history without flinching? What would it cost, politically, institutionally, in terms of the comfortable stories people tell themselves, to build a capital that did not require a well? What would have to change, not in the architecture but in the premise, for the next Atlantis to be something genuinely new rather than something familiar in new light? That is the question New Atlantis is still waiting to be asked. The archive is deep, We've barely begun.